All right, everybody, welcome back to Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by a guest that we got connected through mutual high-caliber acquaintances. So the collective gentlemen, Sean and Chance, and you probably will have just seen their episode pop up by the time you're listening to this one. So without further ado, and so you don't have to sit in silence as I talk about you, Seb, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, man. It's been really cool to connect with you. I guess the really short version is being involved with the collective, being invited on to speak on their platform has been a really gratifying, really challenging, really exciting experience. And they put me on the spot one time. They're like, "Hey, man, who do you want to talk on? Who do you want to join next? And then next time you're on here." And I'd already heard you speak. I'd already seen some of the things that you're working on your social platform. I was like, I want to talk to the Slavmander, right? And so, then lo and behold, they're like, asking, you shall receive. And so I was able to meet you remotely, which is super cool. So I really appreciate your mentorship, remotely, your leadership for the industry and outside of the industry. And when I'm talking about industry, I'm talking about law enforcement, military. But yeah, man. So thank you so much for giving your time for me and my audience today.
Absolutely, man. And this was fully reciprocal. I was already tracking, so.
Yeah, well, thanks, man. So, so much of me is starting to learn about you, and then there's so many layers, and that's what we're talking about in the pre-recording is what you've been up to. You're working on you're finishing up your master's. Maybe PhD thereafter. This is following for the listeners that haven't followed along or maybe haven't connected or seen your social yet. After a full law enforcement career, promotion, working with the RCMP, excuse me, and then all the things that you're working on, right? You have your business. You appear to be a poet. You're a writer, right? Like, is it? Remind me what that's called.
I'm not sure which one are you referring to.
All right, let me pull it up in my notes. The project, and it was called
the Poetic Savagery Project.
Yeah.
The Poetic Savagery Project is basically an audio video sort of all immersive experience into the world of somebody that has multi dimensions, but all those dimensions directed towards work in law enforcement. So it was meant to be an inspirational piece for current and active Leos and first responders to just want to do and be better in all different aspects. So it's actually worked out really, really good, and it's worked out exactly as it's intended to, as an inspirational piece, and it's fun.
Yeah. That's very cool, and I love it because I think that looking at what you put out, there clearly is that poetic dimension, and I mean that as an extreme compliment. Like, I come from definitely a more creative background growing up. I would very much consider myself an artist, and things that I really gravitated towards as a young man. And in my career, law enforcement career, shifted away from that. Right, it's more towards the traditional. It's more regimented. It's systems, it's protocols, and really falling in line so I could be successful. What I found is that in my maturing of my career and as an individual, allowing myself to gravitate back towards those creative dimensions has really helped me skyrocket my potential and that of my team. It was a recent conversation on the collective where Sean's talking about the push-pull and the balance between artistry and athleticism in whatever it is you do. And at first I was so caught off guard, but then as he continued to explain, the artistry, the pivoting, the dance around what you're doing and how to adapt, and then the athleticism being very much that too, right? Being on the balls of your feet, being on your toes, really powering through, just like an athlete trains, just like an athlete has to perform. I really love that. So what does that strike within you when we talk about those things for you?
Yeah, I call that intellectual athleticism. I just like the term. It just sort of makes sense to me, and I can see how, essentially you're operating within the confines of a box, but you have creative ways of of moving and shaking the things within the confines of that box. So and it's really interesting because sometimes we have the box, and then within the box we put another box in there, and we're kind of, we're really limiting ourselves, whereas
Mm-hmm.
creativity has bearing in anything we do. And if you have it, you can start looking for innovative solutions to common problems. And in law enforcement, what do we always see? We see the same problems recurring over and over again, and we see the same solutions applied against those problems. So what do we see? The definition of insanity. You know,
Mm-hmm.
doing the exact same thing, expecting a different outcome. So having that creative juices flowing, and having the ability to weaponize your creativity, man, good stuff. I love that.
Yeah, I've been labeled a bit as being progressive in law enforcement, and that's okay. I mean, when I think about the word progressive and where it derives from is progress, right? So
Hmm.
I'm not saying that I have the solution, but I love the notion that there's a lot of leaders in and out of our industry that are saying, "Hey, we just have to ask why not." And it doesn't mean that this is the worst way. It doesn't mean that this is even a bad way. But how do we know it's a good, great, best way unless we ask those questions? Unless we look across industries and say, "Hey, these guys over here, these guys and gals, they're doing this, and it's really advanced their goals. Is there something that we can learn from and apply for our own team?"
Yeah, and it really takes leaders that have sort of ego free almost, right? Like where you have to be so confident in your own abilities, capacity, and your own work, to not worry about looking at somebody else as if they could potentially, hear me out, do it better.
Hmm.
Like and it's just common sense that if you look at anything there is in life, literally anything, take jujitsu, take playing video games, there's always a million people that take it to a completely different level. And so
Right.
for you to even look at anything thinking that you are remotely close to what the top of the hill looks like, and unfortunately in policing this is often what happens. Like we've done the same thing, and there's something called, not only cognitive bias, but there's outcome biases, where because everything went well for 10 years, therefore you must have done everything right. And we
Hmm.
know that that's not the case. You got lucky. Those are different, right? And if you got lucky and you're not patternizing what it is that you are doing, and how are you supposed to replicate it, and how are you supposed to make it better for the next generation or for the people that are currently working for you? And so you're conflicted between wanting to support and completely resisting change, right? So you have to be somewhere in the middle, and really have the ability to recognize your own biases and how to overcome them.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, we can take that notion, we can apply it to so many industries, right? Cab drivers never thought that Uber would be a thing. When it started coming up, they probably, this is a dumb idea. It's going to fizzle out. Same thing, Blockbuster, Netflix. Like all these quote unquote disruptors. And so sometimes I take a pause, and I like to look at organizational leadership and organizational cultural discussions and articles and such, just to question again, hey, why are we doing what we're doing? Is there something to be learned from this lesson? Learn from history so you don't repeat it, essentially. And what are our blind spots that I'm not even recognizing in having the conversation? So we don't look back and we say, well, that was a huge blunder. We should have seen that coming. Like, where does this exist in law enforcement or in these more, government-based institutions? Because it is harder to change a lot of these things due to the fact that it's government, due to the fact that it's bureaucratic by nature and by design.
Mhm. Yeah, it for me, it's really interesting as a leader. One of the things that I really focused on over the course of my career was always on my sphere of influence. And yes, augmenting that sphere of influence is part of that process, but really I was investing everything I had in the things that I directly had control over, because everybody's worried about controlling the external factors, but what you soon realize is that they stop moving their own sphere of influence forward on account of, well, when it hits this level, or when it hits the chief or whatever, it's going to get shut down, or X, Y, and Z is going to happen. And in a lot of cases it has more to do with the articulation of what it is that they're doing. And so instead
Right.
of focusing internally and say, like, look, I'm going to work on me so that I'm able to present what it is that I'm bringing forward in a different way, it's always, well, we always try to make changes and it always hits a wall. But there is never I've never actually looked at within me how I proposing those changes, how I bring them to bear, how I have the conversations. And so once you start optimizing your own performance in that sense, where you're really introspective on how you are doing things, you can start moving the needle. And I think for you, from what I'm seeing anyway, and from what I'm hearing from you, that's precisely what you're doing. People want to change things, but they want to change things by going head to head. And if you start going head to head with everybody, you are going nowhere real quick.
Mm.
So
Hmm.
so it's important to have the ability to not only want to be innovative and not only want to be solution based when it comes to policing, but you also have to have the tactful and the sort of holistic approach to how you're going to approach this to make it work.
Yeah, and that's my driver. I think a lot of it comes out of just a desire for wanting things to be better. I want things to be better for me, for my team. I want things to be better for the public, which is really what the whole job is about. And so, when I apply that, my early discussions on social and everything was just to be helpful, and a lot of that was just my own sharing of my mindset, my own sharing of my frustrations, or trying to be vulnerable to help others do that, especially through the veins of wellness, which is, a huge pillar for me in the career. I think I believe and know it's very much intertwined with our efficacy out there on the street. So if I can help cops and first responders be a bit more in tune with their own wellness, their own health, then of course they're going to show up better. They're going to show up better at work, better at home. And so then we already see how this is all intertwined, right? And then because I am a law enforcement officer and I care very much about the industry and care very much about what goes on in the community, that's going to continue on whether I'm not a cop, whether I am or am not a cop in 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? So I am invested. And I think that we just need to remember that there is that investment. So let's look at it holistically, have you pointed out a couple times, because everything's connected. Within our lives and within our group, within our community.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and nurturing a connection and uh, sort of researching different ways and different lenses to view the world through. And I mean, I know for me, I've been retired for 2 years now. And when I say retired, I mean that, not quite
Y-
literally,
You're
but
you're quite busy. Yeah, we'll talk about that shortly.
yeah, when I moved on from policing, though, I realized in starting, when I started my master's degree, for example, that even though I had a very extensive operational background, I was viewing life through the same lens. And I learned to see, even though I was already multidimensional, a part of me was stuck in that looking at lens through the lenses of a cop and
Mm,
not ever creating alternative angles and alternative viewpoints to look at life through, and having these conversations with really smart intellectuals and academics and people that are looking at life through different lenses really rounded me out. I was able to, look at some of the things that potentially didn't help me during my career or perhaps even impeded me during my career. And I'm not talking about in terms of career advancement, but I'm talking about in terms of achieving certain outcomes, because I did have this sort of, very narrow field of vision, so to speak. So it's really interesting when you start dabbling around and start changing the lens on those frames of yours, life sort of opens up a whole bunch of possibilities, right?
yeah, and it makes sense. I had a discussion not long ago around the same vein with someone, and there's a reason why we think like a police officer. There's a reason why we think in these similar veins. And a lot of it is truly for survival. A lot of it is because it's effective in a lot of the things we do. But one application is, you treat an unknown threat, you treat, a group of subjects a certain way on the street. And I'm not saying be rude or be aggressive, but you're on high alert. You should not be trustful of the situation. You should be polite, courteous, professional, but ready for what's going to happen, right? But if you bring that energy, if you bring that mindset and that perspective into your relationships with your best friends, with your home life, it is not going to be successful. You see that a lot, right? So that's not to disparage us, but it's to understand and explain why these things happen. And so I love that you recognized how how quickly that had permeated so many ways that you looked at the world. And it sounds like what helped you out of that was surrounding yourself with just other people from other walks, right? Like in your studies, in your postgraduate studies.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a big piece of it. The other piece is it's an international degree. So I was not only exposed to people with different way of thinking, but I was
Mm,
also exposed to people to which, living life is a completely different endeavor in all these various regions of the world. And, not to be ethnocentric, but despite all that we have going on here, a lot of those countries are having struggles that we'll never know anything about. And I think that was a big piece also. And just to kind of speak to what you were just talking about, I love that segue you made there. Risk assessing through essentially physical harm is what we're risk assessing life through. And the problem with that is that not when something is not a matter of physical harm or organizational risk or investigational risk, the stakes are not nearly as catastrophic, and you can play with that. But we as law enforcement officers often will assess risk through the lens of a cop, and that can create a ton of problems, yes, in personal relationship, but it can do so in business as well, because you can
mm,
be the biggest disabler the world has ever seen, because that's never going to work because of X. That's never going to work because of, and you start going down that path. And I had a friend by the name of Jay Park, very, very successful businessman. And he's like, what happens if you fail, in business? Nothing, and even if you have a lot of money invested, at the end of the day, it's money, right? It's not somebody losing their lives or anything like that. And so for him, it was always about, man, I'm as much of an enabler as I was in a policing context, I was a disabler in business
mm,
on account of the way by which I viewed life, but also on account of the way I risk assessed, the steps that I took.
yeah. And that's such a critical self-reflection, right? Because that's gonna be directly intertwined with your success in whatever venture that is. And there might be a place for it, right? But I could definitely see how that would be. I mean, maybe it's very important to find what your role is in that business, right? Maybe you're not going to be the 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 one just driving the passion, right? Maybe you're not the one just try that can really conceptualize the importance of how quickly you need to grow, because you might in the back of your mind be like, hey, we're not like, we're not ending wars here. We're not doing XYZ, but it is important. And I think that sometimes we get too narrow in our focus because we don't see the how the little wins, how the little all everything else just helps society chug along.
Yeah, absolutely. We're missing the bigger picture. We don't have enough detachment. We don't have enough bird's eye view, so to speak, and it, again, really narrows down our field of view. And with that comes, everything else that's associated with that, which is essentially reducing the field of view as everybody else. Because especially if you're an inspirational leader in a leadership position where people are sort of looking up to you and following you and working with you, you know, the way you process information and the way you deal with life is going to tell them more about how they should be doing business. And
Yeah.
so it does have a cost, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we're gonna go a little out of order as we already have. Why not? But
Hmm.
we talk about how busy you are. You've been clearly you're in your studies, which is no joke. Getting a master's. And what are you getting your degree in?
International security, global counterterrorism.
Okay, so that is saving lives. That is
Well, it
critical
has
work.
it has the potential to. How about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you got that. You're popping up on the collective. You
Mhm.
write, you post, you have your own brand, you have your own company consulting. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, mostly right now we've sort of refocused on a lot of the performance coaching piece. Sean Taylor and I specifically aimed at the executive level people, like
Hmm.
the people that are already extremely successful but want to take that and just have that 1%, that 2%, that 3% better. And Sean and I have refocused a lot of our energy on the executive coaching side. But I do, you know, security consulting overseas in dangerous areas. I do close protection. I do public speaking courses. I do, like, there's a million different things. The introspective leader course. So I run a lot of training, and there's various people engaged along the way as well, all tier one personnel and all either from the military or the law enforcement world. And we really take, the best of the best to sort of frame our coaching, and Sean Taylor is a big piece of that, as you know.
Yeah. And I get this. It's very, for a lot of my listeners, it's probably conceptualizing like, oh, it kind of sounds like, what Jocko and company might be doing, right? Like it's just, you have these tried and true, like literal battlefield experiences, critical leadership, and then you can apply it to, other professionals in the industry or military, but also, clearly a lot of people get a lot out of that, right? Not everyone that listens to the Jocko podcast is a military personnel. A lot of people see the lessons of that and get the benefit from those.
For sure. And I would say that if I was to compare the way we kind of coach, is it just slightly different. So Echelon Front does it in a way where, they send their evaluators and they kind of look at the overall picture, they paint a picture of it, and then they sort of respond accordingly with leadership principles, those types of things, which are really foundational or fundamental to their whole sort of system. For us, it's a bit more individualized in that we are looking at mindset, because we understand that regardless of what you're coaching, if the person doesn't look at it with the right lens, they're not taking out of it what they should. So if you were to take, and this is obviously no knock on Jocko and Echelon Front, because I have nothing but the utmost respect for these guys. But if I was to say, take a perfect leadership blueprint and say, okay, Eric, here's how you lead, and your mindset is not in an introspective state, and you are not paying attention and being self-aware and self-regulate, those types of things. Anything that you read or sort of use within an operational context is going to be skewed by the vision, by the fact that you have underlying issues that are unaddressed.
Absolutely.
So we're less concerned about each individual pieces, and we're more concerned about changing you at the core, so that whatever happens after, including learning leadership, including learning the way to do things, is dramatically improved.
Yeah, no, that's
so it's
huge.
a little bit different.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I bring up Jocko because it's such a big presence, but at the same time, knowing you and observing and having listened to hours of Jocko, through the years, I got really big into his podcast years ago. But then, you hear where he's coming from, and I think that for me, and again, no knock on Jocko, a very impressive individual. But after a while, a lot of the podcasts were very similar for me, right? And so for me, it's a lot about, okay, cool. It's like I read that book. I don't need to keep reading that book over and over. However, like revisiting that book in a couple of years could be very helpful. So like literally at this point in time, I like re-downloaded a couple episodes of Jocko and I really enjoyed it. But same thing like Rogan. Like I've kind of, I used to be diehard about Rogan every episode, and then I haven't listened to him in a couple of years. But again, it's just trying to expose to new ideas and new perspectives, new style. But before I keep rambling, I'd love what you said, and the application for me, at least I think for a lot of the people that might be listening to this, is we're going to go to a lot of trainings. Your department's going to put you through a lot of trainings, and I definitely can reflect on myself, and depending on my mindset or my mood, my attitude, maybe it was that day, maybe it was in those months, right? Was I more cynical towards the job? Was I more cynical towards the leadership that set this training up? Or was I just more cynical of the message or how they presented? Or was I more open-minded? And so, one was a non-law enforcement specific training, and it was based on emotional intelligence, EQ, right? I think that if we take our egos off, we're like, okay, this is critically important, right? Like EQ is literally how you connect with other people. Do we want the best avenues to do that within our team out in the public? Absolutely. But when you tell everyone that it's mandatory, you need to sign up, or you're going to be facing discipline, and you hear about how some people kind of put their arms up, and then there's all this buzz about who walked out of the training. Well, of course, like that's going to be a defensive posture. You're not going to get anything from it. If you assume that people are talking to you like you're an idiot and you don't know anything about this, then you might be really defensive. Might not get much from it. But if you recognize, hey, this is an important topic, and now we have this expert coming in, there's got to be something. There's got to be a couple nuggets I get out of this 4 hours, or else I'm going to sit here and it's going to be a waste. I think it's that fixed versus growth mindset. It's just, how do you want to receive? How do you want to show up? So I can feel that in myself and those that have been around me. So I think that's important to recognize. It takes two to tango, and so do you want to learn or do you want to waste your time?
Yeah, absolutely, man. And you can have the perfect circumstances in front of you. Maybe the leadership has communicated effectively what the benefits are going to be for you. Maybe that guest speakers you're really interested in. But if you don't optimize your own ability to reflect and to be self-aware and self-regulate as you are engaging in the process, you may find yourself, thinking about the dishwasher, doing, whatever the case may be. And so now the concept that we bring back to bear is essentially focus is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
That don't act like focus isn't a choice, and don't give me the old, well, I can only focus for so long. No, no, no. You only want to focus for so long. It's not that you can't.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a saying that says sometimes you don't know how strong you are until being strong is the only choice you have. But it's exactly the same with this. You don't know how long you can focus until you do a job that's catastrophic enough that if your focus sway, people are losing their lives, and if you've had the sort of the honor of doing that in an operational setting, it never leaves you. But all of those lessons are metaphorically applicable through the entire spectrum of activities that we engage in as cops. And everybody's worried about, is the speaker good, and does he know his stuff, and where is he from? What if he was the worst speaker in the world, but he comes in and you focus so much on being that receptor that you catch one golden piece of information in there?
Mm-hmm.
Because you will. That's, you can talk to anybody and learn something from anybody. And so it's really a change in attitude that's needed in policing, in my opinion. And there's a lot of reasons why this is happening. I mean, really, we could, go down the rabbit hole of thinking about who are the types of people that get hired as police officers, and why do they want to be police officers, and what is the purpose behind it, and what was the there's a lot of sort of underlying issues, I should say, and that's no different than people wanting to be MMA fighters. My mom used to say to me, if you didn't like violence to the point you say you didn't like violence, you'd be a monk, not a cop.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she was a psychologist, so I kind of take that into
Oh,
into
interesting.
account. But yeah.
Yeah, that's huge. And I think about when it's your own outlook, your outlook, when it's your own attitude, think about what benefits could come, right? Maybe not even where does this benefit me, what can I learn? But hey, I'm in this classroom or I'm in this auditorium for the next X hours. What benefits could come from this? And it could be literally taking notes on how the speaker was not that great, and you could reflect on the next time you speak, what do you do? Man, she's saying a lot. I say a lot. Okay, there's an area of opportunity for me. It could also be leadership, right? You don't want to be there, but there's a lot of people that look up to you and you want them to absorb the information. Even if you are a little bit on your high horse, you're like, I'm not going to learn anything today. But these people to the left and right of me need to pay attention. I'm going to show up as a professional. I'm going to have a smile on my face. I'm going to participate. Right? I'm going to be vulnerable in these little exercises because I think it'll be helpful. At the same time, there's this application that I have sometimes where I act differently because I'm a cop, and I act differently because people know I'm a cop. And it is a little bit of that role modelship, right? If I'm in uniform and I'm going through the grocery store, of course, I'm looking around at people. I'm trying to be aware of my surroundings, even if it's just to get a snack. But I do see people when they make eye contact, I try to smile. And that's because I know that the likelihood of people forming an opinion negative about the police is going to be a little better if I smile. I'm not going to do that if I'm not in uniform, right? I might make eye contact with someone and give them a little courteous nod or a little like kind of smirk, but I'm not that kind of person. I'm going to be more likely to go in, get out, do my thing. But I know that I'm an example. I'm a representative, and so I'm going to show up. And so I think that there is a translation for that when we think about what we're burdened with and what we have to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I really like the piece that you speak about earlier about how you address the course. And one of the things I'd like to go back onto is when you said, maybe I won't be learning something today. Well, if the day starts like this, it's an absolute that you will not be learning anything.
Mm-hmm.
The concept of manifestation is not a psychological wazoo concept. It's a neuroscientific process, and it's lining up your thoughts with your actions, and opens up your mind in a way that you are now more receptive to certain things, that you hear more, that you connect better, like all of those things. And so having that sort of positive attitude when you start, and I'm not talking about toxic positivity here, I'm talking about I will learn something from that speaker regardless how good that speaker is, because learning something out of that person is up to me, not up to them to teach me, right? It's just retaking control over the process. So I really like that. But yeah, you're absolutely correct with it's just a very different, very special and specific industry, and we need to have some protective mechanisms in place. And there is people willfully wanting to hurt us, and as a result of that, it's difficult to not carry that on your face. It's also difficult to not carry the defund the police actions. It's also to not carry the internal complaints and everything else that we consistently deal with. But every chance you have at representing your uniform, your organization, and your peers in a positive light is a gift to the community, to your community. And I took time of my day, all time I didn't have often, out of my day to make that happen, just to ensure that that was going the extra mile. And if I was involved operationally, I would make sure that by the time I left, there was a bow wrapped around that scene. Like I
Mm.
wasn't, just okay, see you later. We just broke everything. See you later, kind of thing. It went far beyond that. What else can I bring? What other value can I bring to this operation, to this sort of synergical relationship, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I love that. There's a piece for sure. I mean, I love that whole exchange, but there's a piece I want to focus back in on for the listeners, and it's that it's the understanding and the empathy with the officer that's doing the day to day that you and I aren't doing. But you were there, and I was there. But it's understanding that you're going to wear that on your face when you know for a fact that people out there are very wanting and willing to hurt you and your peers and your friends and your brothers and sisters. So when you meet an unknown, you don't know what their intent is, and even if, especially if you're dispatched to that location and they're one of the people involved, you don't know what's going on. They're making eyes at you. You don't know whether they're going to provoke you. You don't know whether they're going to assault you. It is hard not to furrow your brow and start to, tuck your chin and do all these things that are not inviting, mannerisms. Like when I see a long-term friend, I throw my head back, right? And I open my arms out of my chest, right? It's not a defensive posture like my fists are coming up to get by my jaw. But I think that there are those, there's the neuropsychological connection. Tried to talk about what you're talking about earlier, but yeah, it is imprinting on your brain and your survival instinct that, hey, this is not a safe situation until you know it is. And generally, if you're in uniform and out in the field, you never know it is. It never really truly is. Um, so yeah, I just want to kind of harken back to that because I think it is. I can anticipate how it could be regarded a certain way from officers that are in the day to day doing 10, 12, 14 hours uh, a day. And they're like, well, it's easy for you to say, Eric, like you're recruiting and you're doing this and you're doing that. Uh, you're not going to call to call to call. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not understandable, but it's very critical that you're aware of that, right? When you interact with people.
Yeah, I mean, for me, and again, this feeds right into something that's a massive pet peeve of mine, which is victim mentality, and
Mm,
that kind of inject of, oh, Eric, you're X, Y, and Z. It's like, hey, dude, I was doing that, 20 years before you were. Like, I've been there, we've been there, you've been there, we've all been there. So we can all look at our circumstances and think that we have the hardest job in the world. The reality is, if I change your environment right now and I bring you somewhere where you're like you sort of knowledge, skills, and abilities are exposed, you're going to find that you're going to have a lot harder time doing other jobs. And so
Hmm.
I think it's really easy to think, and the propensity is to think that policing is all about patrol, for example, right? And it is the angular stone of policing. There's no question that that's the case, and you have to be comfortable and good at that before you can move on to anything else, in my
Hmm.
opinion. Of course, it doesn't always reflect in reality. But what's important to realize is that there's also a propensity for people on the road to think that they have the worst job the world has ever seen. That's them
Right.
not knowing that when you sit to write an information to obtain on a warrant, and you have to write a 396-page information to obtain so that you can get a freaking judicial
Yeah.
authorization to do
Yeah.
anything, we'll talk, right? Like, or if you're in the eye on a surveillance shift in freaking -40 somewhere, so there's always something else. And the fact that the jobs are different doesn't negate the fact that there are difficulties in all of those jobs. And it's important to recognize that, because otherwise we'll turn ourselves into victims. So it's important to look at, in order to not do that, it's important to have a healthy perspective on the reality of things. And until you've been exposed to various sections, until you've worked in other areas, you may or may not know that. But if you know that to be the case, you can ask the questions. You can be sort of more exploratory in your approach, right? Instead of just cynical, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The relationships are so critical, right? So if you're a patrol dog and you've been in it for 10, 12 years and you have a friend in detectives, right? You could very well better empathize the fact that, hey, I got my struggles, you got yours, but I would not change seats with you. And there are a lot of people that are very wise to that, right? They either had a little bit of interaction, or they just take the time to learn, or shadow, or interact and see, hey, I don't want that to be my day to day. I have a little taste of that here and there when I have to write a warrant, and good on you. Like, you're doing all that. You're getting called in. I'm not getting called in. I do my time. I go home. I decompress. There is very much that. So I think when we stop, and again, it is that it's that victim mentality where you're so focused on you, what's burdening you, how unfair things are. It's like, no, like, let's just get better. Let's network. Let's elevate each other. Let's collaborate. And I think for me, one thing I think about that's helpful, especially in this moment, is getting off of the road was very helpful for my development. Right when I was in patrol, there's so many times where I was so target focused, and it is a thing that I do anyway. But whatever my seat is, but I get so target focused, and I focus on all the things that patrol needs and all the things that we need, and why this, why that. But to get removed outside of that, to support side, to neighborhood engagement, which was a longer term problem solving thing for a little bit, and then hiring, recruiting, you see the big picture just because you're able to change seats a little bit. And I think that the same thing happened for you. It sounds like when you were, you're in grad school, it exposes you to all these new ideas and perspectives. So that's critical. But for me, a lot of, I could think about my haters and the naysayers, and sure, they're going to say that I'm preaching and this and that, but really it comes back to a notion that resonates with me that I heard relatively recently, which is that we are here to help our prior selves in the service we do and in the mentorship we do. So just about everything I say it with the context of recognizing that this is what I would have loved to have heard when I was in my 20s. This is exactly the type of message that would have been really beneficial when I was, overworked, or when I was not sleeping and I was just trying to grind harder and harder, but not seeing the whole picture. And I was becoming really cynical towards the public, or XYZ, right? Fill in the blank. And so just to recognize that a lot of these lessons, a lot of these topics are because I learned that, and I needed to learn that. And if I could save someone having to learn it the hard way, then I absolutely will. And so that's why I appreciate exactly what you're doing, right? Um, you had your law enforcement career, and there's so many lessons learned from that as you continue to build business and your education, and your fostering growth through the collective and so many other means.
Yeah, man, we're right in line on that, and for me, I would say even before going to the academic system, I spent 16 years in the tactical space, and all of a sudden I find myself at the commanding officer's office overseeing 8,200 members. All of a sudden I went from a team of 24 tight knit, cohesive unit with selected individuals doing things full time, in a sort of elevated tempo, and I find myself now having a bird's eye view on all the organizational problems and all the problems encountered by other units, and I realize, holy, wait a minute, the things that we were complaining about were infinitesimal compared to some of the problems that are occurring in other units, in other sections, in places where leadership is not nearly as valued, and just where money isn't, and those types of things. So it really took me from the ground, where all I could see was my shoes and whatever my eyesight will allow me to, my field of vision will allow me to, and get onto a freaking plane and go up in the air, and have that really, really fulsome bird's eye view. So I think there would be benefit in doing this even in the leadership context, in terms of having, say, taking your sergeants over to the white shirts office, and have the conversation, have them into critical meetings, have them into, and so that way you can have the bridge the gap approach, where you have, instead of having such a disparity between your leadership and your rank and file, you have a common link there. And that's kind of what my job was as a sergeant major, was to be that link, represent sort of the commanding officer with the troops, and represent the troops and their interests with the commanding officer, but also knowing when it's time to say, look, guys, like, here's the bigger picture that you're not getting, and here's other factors that have to be considered in order for us to, say yay or nay to a certain demand, or to action certain things. And so I think there's a lot of that's missing. And the problem with cops is, because there's professionally induced cynicism that turns to nihilism sometimes, in a very destructive way, there is a propensity to jump on that cynical response as soon as something is misunderstood or simply unknown. So if it's unknown or misunderstood, it's automatically against me, instead of what, let's try to fact find here, and have some, how I feel is completely irrelevant. How I feel doesn't matter. What is the reality? So I'm always trying to sort of balance that piece.
So much there. That was literally where I wanted to go next, was, translating leadership rather than just, hey, it is this. Like, where do you create that bridge? And it is really through empathy. And what I hear is you talking about how it takes going to the troops, right? And to relay that, take the time, have the intent. This is literally a battle I felt through a lot of my leadership development, if you want to call it that, right? Being a young sergeant, 5.5 or so years ago, the first line supervisor, right? It's a critical role in any organization, making sure that all the intent gets passed back and forth, but also I say back, but I also say forth, right? You need to bring back that boots on the ground information. They're closest to the problem. They have this critical info, and you need to bring it back up, right? So it's being a diplomat, right? It's being tactful. The things that you talked about earlier, where I feel like that's where, my perception is that I was pretty good at that, right? I didn't have a huge agenda, but really I just wanted everyone to go along, and it's still something that I want. At the same time, a few years into being a sergeant, I felt that, looking back, it's easier to see, I became really, really about the guys, right? And that is a critical priority, right? You take care of your guys and what they need so they can take care of the mission. However, because of silos, because of lack of communication, intentful communication, I started to form narratives and be a part of narratives like, oh, admin doesn't care. Oh, they're not listening. And then it took a little bit where I recognized I was stewing, and so I went to admin, right? Like this machine admin, right? No, I went to these leaders that were very, I had been very close with through the years, but then it was really just saying, hey, this is a concern, this is how it feels. But then when you go to talk to someone and you have that interaction, then you realize that they aren't this faceless, nameless, emotionless entity. They're a person. They're trying to do the best they can. And so literally I feel myself coming back down from the mountain saying, guys, we just need to just go talk to people if you have this issue, right? Or you perceive this thing, or maybe they don't know, or maybe we're just not hearing and feeling that they are considering this. They have all these different priorities. And I've liked to say this for a while. They have a literal different job. Their job is not yours. Your job is not theirs. And it takes all these jobs to make an effective organization. So let's not start pointing fingers again, right? It goes from patrol to the investigator, right? Let's not point fingers on who has it better and you have your ivory tower or whatever. We say this all jokingly, but then quickly it bleeds into this actual resentment at times, especially when people don't get it. They don't have the connection, they don't have those relationships, or they let them deteriorate over time. And then they don't understand the difference in mission, but how each person's individual role and mission is part of the greater one.
Yeah, man. The best way to affect the change that you want to see is to be the change that you want to see. And it's if your role in this organization or in any organization is cynicism based, I'm on the wrong end of everything. Like you are guaranteed to never contribute anything of importance to the collective, and so you may be contributing to your own experience. And I would say that if that's the case, it will be a temporary state of affair, because one day somebody will see right through all of this, and you're not going to continue to climb, so to speak. And I've seen it with leaders even that get promoted really really quickly on account of driving a bunch of people over, and one day they hit the walls of all walls and never go again anywhere and fizzle out to nothing. So it's really important to sort of curb that cynicism approach, based approach to processing the world when you're in policing. Now, another piece of this is nobody's holding you in there at gunpoint. Nobody is
Mm-hmm.
at all. And so if you don't like your circumstances to the point where you feel that you're being wronged by your organization and everybody else has it better than you, then change. Because
Yep.
if that's the case, but I'm going to surmise that once you start looking around and once you start truly fact finding, regardless of how you feel, you're going to realize that you don't have it worse than anybody else. You guys are
Yeah.
all sort of in the same. And once you start realizing that, your cynicism sort of lessens, and you can start looking at things and critically analyzing things instead of just jumping on bandwagons. And this was always a big pet peeve of mine as well in the leadership position, is when you start seeing your leaders jumping on the burning bandwagons of the rank and files, because everything is so catastrophic and everything is so, and so now the leaders are jumping on and now everybody's going the same direction, but the direction is wrong. It's almost like, as a leader and as leaders coming through the ranks, and when I say leaders, I don't mean rank leaders. I mean, we're all leaders. We're
Yeah.
community leaders. We're leaders. We're entrusted to lead, problem solving mechanisms. And ultimately, we just, the lack of leadership isn't a prospect that should be acceptable for any cops. Like, we need to have the ability to lead. And so having the ability to have that sort of semi-sanitized view of the things that we do and engage in, without necessarily getting sucked in the old emotional vortex and going down that rabbit hole where you're completely counterproductive and all you've done is bitch for the last 10 years. But realizing that the door is right here and you could have walked out of it, you could have taken an opportunity somewhere else. Well, this didn't work on account of this and this. Okay, so this wasn't a priority, so you had to reprioritize. So so it's again, it's taking all of these external factors that are making your life seemingly miserable
Mm-hmm.
as far as you are concerned, and taking ownership over the actual process. What it is that forced you in that position, what it is that's keeping you in that position, and what it is that prevents you from going somewhere else. And if the answer is you have all these excuses as to why none of it is happening or whatever, then you need to reprioritize, and you need to look at what it is that you want to prioritize in the context of not only your career but life as well. And wellness obviously should be a big piece of that. And if you don't prepare for wellness, you better be prepared for illness, as they say, right?
Yeah. That's huge. We need to be aware of our ego. We need to be aware of our narratives and then our inputs, right? Let's say that you do that reflection, you're like, "Oh man, I am in a bad place. I'm in a negative spiral. There aren't there isn't a better place for me to go, and I do want to do this job. I don't want to be a victim." Okay, cool. You start to recognize that. Now what? And for me, it would be focusing on your inputs, right? So what are those inputs? And they are things like wellness, right? That's the low-hanging fruit that you have full autonomy and ownership over. Whether you wake up and you take a brisk walk around in the morning as you sip your coffee, or you do no activity, that's your choice, right? Whether you eat, some chicken breast and rice, or you eat 3 burgers and fries over the course of the day. Like, that's your choice. And right, so we have to recognize there are reasons why something is easier or harder, but it's our choice. And then what are we listening to, right? Or is it our negative, patrol partners, or do we try to hang out with that new guy because he's pretty upbeat and he wants to do good things in this work? And well, heck, I'm not that idealistic anymore, but I can sure help him feel better and safer about how he does his job. And that's going to rub off on you, right? So we can start to choose, our social media, our news, whether we listen to it or not, what we listen to the collective. That's my little plug. So, yeah, these positive inputs, right? Like, to take you out of that echo chamber that can be so negative at times.
Yeah, man. And very, very few places in the workplace can be as caustic as policing. And this is on account of take all of the human experience and intensify it. Because that's essentially what happens in policing, in military context, especially in operational deployments. In garrison, not so much. But if you start, looking at war deployment, or you start looking at being on the streets doing the job, that's happening. That's a fact. So we need to recognize that as well, so we can keep in check slightly better. And it's important to recognize it in others. And I really like, obviously Musashi. Once you see the way broadly you see it in all things, and I'm starting to see, looking back now, I'm starting to see so many of the caustic and dangerous behaviors that we had as individuals within the context of the organization, and that doesn't take me out of it. Like, I've done my fair share of negative, inputting in the organization until the years where I was forced to grow out of that, so to speak. But when I look back and when I listen to some people, it's clear and evident that it's alive and well, in the policing world. And that I think having these types of conversations hopefully is going to help. And sometimes when you listen to certain things or certain people speak about certain things, you may have an emotional reaction, an unfavorable reaction to what you're hearing. And when that happens, I propose to you that there's probably something there that you should be paying attention to. There's a reason why you're negatively responding, or you feel negative emotions in relation to something that was said, say, in a conversation between Eric and I, or this next person. And it's important that if it elicits a sort of a response from you, negative or otherwise, that you look into what is happening here, right? Instead of, well, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, wait a minute. Let's critically analyze this,
Yeah.
But it's tough, man. It's constant work, like we have to be physically, mentally, emotionally. Everything has to be dialed in because everything is interconnected. None of those systems are independent from each other. So if you're having an issue with occupational stress injuries, or if you're having exposed trauma exposure, like, repeated trauma exposure, which is obviously a big problem in policing, but you're, say, out of shape, or you're not eating properly, and you're not sleeping properly, those things are compounding every issue you may encounter within the context of your career. So you need to have that sort of multifaceted approach to being the person that you need to be. Hence why that Poetic Savagery project was so powerful, because it really sort of laid down, the landscape of what that sort of looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, we've dove in all these intricacies, which I love, and I'm glad the listeners have now exposure to you, and certainly we'll end it with where they can find you. But I'd be remiss if I didn't ask a little bit about your origin story, which is what I don't know about you. I know a bit about how you think, and I know the content that you put out, and I know I would never claim to know how your brain works, right? I know what I hear and how it helps me elevate my game. But where did this all start, Seb? Was as far as getting into law enforcement and your upbringing and your background growing up? Walk me through a little bit of that.
Mm-hmm. How much time you got?
I got time.
So, very humble beginnings. Single mom, 15 years old, young mom. And by the time, I essentially lived with mom on my own for, the better part of my first decade plus. And I eventually would have two sisters, but my sisters would eventually live with their dad, which was sort of a separated operation. I never really had a dad in the picture whatsoever, as far as I was concerned. My sisters have share a dad, and mom was. As you would expect from a 15-year-old mom going into the first 5 or 6 or 7 years of her life, there was a lot of adversity, and some of it, um, she sort of was responsible for, right? Obviously, as a youth that's negotiating having a baby in the 70s, and interracial babies, to boot, at the
Mm-hmm.
time. And so there was a lot of adversity there, but eventually what would happen, and one of the important piece here, without getting into too much details, is that she always, the one thing I got, so I never had toys, I never had clothes, nice clothes or whatever, because we didn't have the financial ability to do that. But one gift that she did give me is she truly believed that speaking to me like an adult would and having long extended conversations about absolutely everything would help me in life. And she made sure that we did that. And sometimes she would be working 16, 17 hours, coming home, coming straight into my room, waking me up so we could have a 45-minute conversation, even though I had school the next morning. And eventually, as she matured and became much older and wiser, she ended up becoming a therapist, a psychologist, therapist, clinical therapist. And I was exposed to the way sort of the brain works through her, through a bit of osmosis, so to speak, because we're
Mm-hmm.
having so many in-depth conversations already at a young age, and now she
Yeah.
brings all this sort of technical knowledge to the equation. So I was able to sort of have a lens that's favorable to understanding those mechanisms, right? So I just very intuitive, good emotional intelligence, and mom doing that was good enough for me. And eventually, this is during the biker war between the Rock Machine, the Hells Angels in Quebec. And for those of you who don't know, the Quebec chapters of the Hells Angels back in the days was the most dangerous chapter in the world, bar none. And that's coming straight from Sony Barger. It was attempt, murder in club lineups with rocket launchers and, IEDs and vehicle-borne IEDs and all this stuff. It was a crazy time. And I remember one time I was coming back from a school trip, and I was with mom, and we saw a bunch of dudes with balaclavas, and they had all these bikers on the ground, cuffed behind their backs, and they were sort of guarding them. And I asked mom, I said, "Who are these guys?" And she's like, "Well, those are the guys that aren't scared." So I said, "Well, I'd love to be one of them." And she's like,
Mm.
"Well, start working," kind of thing. And she just let me have it right there. So right then and there, at about 9 or 10 years old, even though I was already sort of predisposed to that kind of work, just on account of the games I was playing, or everything I was doing was always either special forces or police related. And then eventually, after that cataclysm, I would eventually, decide that this was the path that I was wanting to follow. And so I joined the military when I was 18. And of course, at the time, for us Canadian forces, that's pre 9/11, right? There was nothing there really to do. It was it was a very sort of low point in the Canadian forces as far as like budget was concerned, but operational deployments were very limited, all that type of stuff. So eventually, even though I loved the military more than I expected I would, it was always a stepping stone for policing for me. And then eventually I would be at a crossroad where I had to select where I was going to go. And I
Mm-hmm.
stuck to the original plan, which was policing. So in 2000 or 2001, I went into training, and then 7 years into my service, I sort of, or actually less than that, 3.5 years into my service, I got to my first tactical unit. Full time was a covert unit, and then I went 12 years on what we call here the Lower Mainland Emergency Response Team, which is a large scale, full time, very active SWAT team, essentially, for American listeners. And I spent 12 years on the team, 7 years as a team leader before I left for the commanding officer's office as the sort of chief warrant officer for British Columbia. And so those things were all in line, if you look at it, like the sort of the leadership exposure and development that I was honored to receive during my time on the team and through thousands of operations. and all this good stuff, all the things, all the kinks I was able to sort of shake off, and really uh, crossed over very meaningfully in my job with the commanding officer, in having the ability to continue to lead, in the way that I was. And you are absolutely correct about the emotional intelligence piece. That is that, in conscientiousness, there's really nothing that's more important for leaders. And when we're talking leaders, I'm talking inspirational leaders. I don't care if somebody's a designated leader, but what I care about is people that are inspirational leaders. The types of leaders that not only you want to work for, you want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was always sort of my own personal mission statement, and I was willing to stop at nothing to conquer, to materialize that through my actions, not just some miraculous, leadership wand that's being, ding,
Yeah.
kind of. So that's kind of my journey with the policing piece.
That's huge. I love that. I get curious a lot of times. I had a really difficult and mostly lacking relationship with my dad. And so, part of this project, like I found myself speaking with, partially on purpose and partially by accident. Like there's been a lot of people that have been on the show that had their own struggles with, their lack of fatherhood or strong male role models. And I think that there is a common thread in a lot of us coming into service because of that. Um, but yeah, I want to focus in on that quote, from your mom, like those are the guys who aren't scared. And then you're like, yeah, I want to be that. Because, for my own self, I can recognize in hindsight what brought me to policing, right? There's not that early, childhood interest or anything like that. But ultimately, when people ask me what brought me in is wanting to serve or wanting to be some part of something bigger or stand up for the little guy. And I realized that, I'm the little guy, or, I was scared, and there's so many things that, we're afraid of. And then I think that for a lot of people that come into military and first responder world and life is that it's okay to be afraid, and I'm going to work on it, and I'm going to give myself some tools that I can help myself and others, and be part of the reason why people don't need to be afraid.
Yeah, man, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more with you. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure and to ensure that you are multidimensional in all that, and that includes your physicality, your intellectuality, your relationships, your social life, all of those things have to be in perfect sort of, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to be in good balance,
Mm-hmm.
right?
All right, so let me ask you, after clearly a very successful military and then under law enforcement career, you were active on an elite full-time team for quite some time, and then you got into the upper stratosphere with promotion and organizational leadership. Um, what prompted and led you to transitioning out of law enforcement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I just generally like to explore and adventure in life. And the prospect of being in the same place for, say, 30 years isn't super exciting prospect to me. And I can appreciate the loyalty of it. And I can appreciate, but I believe that how long your contribution to the cause is pretty irrelevant if the intensity level is kept so high. Yeah, you have people that are around for 40 years, but for 40 years they've been sort of complaining about everything for 39 years, whereas you may have somebody that decides to do a stint of 5 years in policing, and for 5 years they're all in. And so for me, I was between the military and police, I was combining 23 years of service, 20 years in policing. And I just kind of looked back, and my options were to go back to the team, which was something that I favored on account of I joined the organization to be a part of it, of that team. And so for
Mm-hmm.
me to do anything else would, and I really did not have an interest in, I wasn't going to do that, because now I'm bringing my sort of lack of interest to a new problem, and try to obviously professionally action against that problem. But if in the sort of bottom of my heart, this isn't something that I really want to do, now I'm doing a disservice to the people that are putting a lot of hard time to try to make certain things happen in the new section, a new unit or new role or whatever that is. And so I was never going to do that. just in all fairness to everybody that engages in the process. And so when the prospect of going back to the team came around, and I started realizing that I was building up anxiety, those types of things, which is something that I'm not afflicted with on the regular, in a
Mm-hmm.
normal amount, but not abnormally. Um, I started asking questions like, why are you worried about this? And I think I was more in love with the idea of going back as an operator that I was about the job that I was going to embark on, which was being the team leader for the team leaders, which would bring me to full obsessive mode again, right? I wouldn't really
Mm.
have a choice. And for the 2 years in the commanding officer's office, I finally had struck some balance between work and life. And I just realized that I didn't want to go back on call, and I didn't want to get pulled out of every function with my kids. And I didn't want to, so I looked back and I said, okay, so now what? Are you staying in policing, or are you trying some different? And I just went the route of wanting to try some different. And I thought to myself, like, look, what's the worst that happens? You know? And the
You can
reality
always go
is
back if you hate it. You can always go back, right?
100%. You can go
Yeah.
back on decisions. You can do certain things. You can go for other organizations if you feel so inclined.
Mm-hmm.
If there's nothing left there in your own organization, there's all kinds of other options. But yeah, and it's been 2 years now, and I have absolutely zero regret. I mean, yes, the stress of not getting that regular paycheck dropped in your account, no matter what, is real. But it's also the reality of 90% of people in the workforce.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so
The
so
stability afforded by the government, there's not very much that can even compare.
agreed. And so I think it's important to recognize, but at the same time, for me, it was all about: is this something that you're still loving? Is this something that you still want to engage full time in? And because of the cost of policing, it's important to be fully invested. Because if you're not, you're taking some serious hits on
Mm-hmm.
on 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 a subsystem that's not necessarily wired for it, unless you have that purpose driven attitude in relation to policing.
Yeah, and we see that a lot, right? We see people that are resigned to whatever position, right? At the officer level, at the upper administrative level, where people are checked out, where people are just waiting on the paycheck, on retirement, and then how much it bogs us all down, right? So, a takeaway for me listening to that is clearly you're a perpetual learner, you're a perpetual experiencer. And so, in the curious way that you approach life is to say, hey, as at least I'm perceiving this, is that you know what the track looks like if you do a full career, but to maintain the level of intensity and curiosity and growth, you recognize that it was probably time to leave. And I love that because I don't know how many conversations at the time that people hear this, they'll know that I've received my official promotion, which kicks in a few days from now, as far as like you and I talking. And so a lot of that dynamic, though, even from people that I respect and peers or otherwise, they would ask, "Don't you feel like you're promoting too early?" Right? And that was a literal thing I remember hearing through my whole career was, "You don't want to promote too early because then you get stuck." And that's such again, we're going back to fixed mindset, right? Whereas growth mindset would, going off my own prerogatives and my interest, is that I know I can grow and challenge myself a lot with this promotion. And if it makes me stuck at an upper level, then I can always pivot somewhere else, right? Um, Maybe I didn't imagine promoting beyond commander at my organization, but maybe that's different in 5 years. I might feel dramatically different where I might promote past that, or who knows what could happen in life, right? So I'm trying to be a little bit more in that. It's okay to have some unknowns. It's actually great to have some unknowns as long as you're driving towards a purpose and your values are lining that and fueling that. Then I am a planner, but it takes me out of that more anxious unknown state. It's more like an excited unknown state.
Yeah, you're straight into exploration, which is the only way to fix anxiety, really. And it's congrats on the promotion, by the way.
Thank you, man.
And yeah, what's really interesting with the promotional process, or even with promotions in general, is you will often hear people that are constant complainers complain about leadership, but what you'll never hear them say is how they intend to be the leaders they would like to see.
Mm.
So generally what happens is the same person that complains all the time is the same person that uses the fact that the system is broken to not want to promote in those positions, not realizing that along the way you can do a lot of buffering between whatever it is that organizationally you feel is wrong and the rank and file by being that person that has a sphere of influence that can be created. And at the end of the day, for the members on the road doing the work, their leader, their direct leader is the organization. Like there isn't, a million other steps after that. And so I think that having the ability to recognize that you can't be complaining about everything without doing anything about it. And you can't be complaining that there's no wellness mechanism in place for the constant trauma and abuse that you're subjected to, only to turn your back in the patrol office and have a conversation about somebody that's sick yet again, and have and really go against what you are claiming you want, because that's exactly what happens. Is like the culture eats itself,
No, for sure.
and then once we eat ourselves, we don't take any ownership of it, and what we do is we project whatever it is that the behaviors are bringing to bear to upper management, or to people in position of leadership, or to the organizations, or to the government, or whatever the case may be. And
Hmm.
so again, it's a perfect way to not contribute to the solution, contribute to the problem, and walk away. you know and so it really doesn't do anything. It's very counterproductive, it's very caustic, it's very toxic, and it makes everybody's life miserable. Imagine if you, as a person and as a leader, could be responsible for 12 people going to work happy. Well, that 12 people happiness reverberates with the people that they love, with their families, with their kids, and it goes on, because the wife now had a great conversation with you last night, and now she's not going to teach at school and offload on the students that are now,
Hmm.
and so what we do is impactful, a lot more impactful. And the fact that we cannot quantify specifically the impact that we have does not negate the impact that we have. And that's something that I think we need to understand as cops. When you're addressing life in a certain way, you're injecting poison in everybody else's life, and I mean this respectfully, and it's important to understand that. But uh, yeah, it's the propensity to do that in the law enforcement realm is quite elevated, and it has to do with building cynicism on account of we're dealing 100% of the time with the 1%ers, and so
Hmm.
you get to think that the world is 100% wrong, not realizing that you've been dealing with a very, very small margin, but you've been doing it full time, which is the reason why your lens is so tinted, right?
Yeah, and that's where I love the aspect of culture and how everyone, right? We talk about leadership at every level. Everyone can affect the culture. And so if we recognize these things, yes, we recognize that we're dealing with a lot of the unsavory aspects of society, but we have our own systems, whether it is actually written out or whether it is just something that is a cultural dynamic where you are supporting each other and you feel committed in that, and you feel like you're not alone and you are valued from your leadership, from your peers. Then you can overcome a lot, right? Then you don't feel like you're always under attack. And so it's a lot of times I think that is the low hanging fruit, although it could take a lot of intensity to start moving that momentum or start building that momentum, especially depending on where your organization and where your people are at the time.
Yeah, for sure. And again, it kind of comes down to, are those things that are directly in your control, or are those things that you may potentially have some level of influence over? You invest a little bit less, and if you have zero influence over it, and there is no foreseeable way in which you can achieve that, then I don't sweat it, right? And so, what the queen does with the color of the uniform is completely irrelevant to me. I have no, I have there's nothing I can do about that unless I'm being tapped on the shoulder to provide some input. But and even if I was to volunteer the input, what is that going to do, right?
Hmm.
And so it's important to understand that, yeah, I could do that, but I have a limited amount of bandwidth, and that bandwidth has to be used to make life bearable for most people in my direct sphere of influence. And so I really always brought that back to me. What can I do right now? And by doing that, you're optimizing the way you're conducting business, and you're optimizing the people, the way the people who work for you are conducting business. And it, as we mentioned earlier, it far exceeds just the business side. But those things are constant work in progress. It's a constant push forward. It's a constant wanting to be better. It's a constant wanting to continue to learn, and realizing that no matter how successful you've been so far, some of the things that you've been successful on account of luck or other factors, that are necessarily not sort of replicatable. And if you are to pattern them so that you may teach them to other people on account of succession planning, you need to have the ability to recognize what those patterns are, so that you're able to proliferate them and pass them on.
Yeah, that's huge. It's everything, right? It is luck. It is preparation. It's where all that what is it? What preparation meets opportunity, or something to that effect. Seb, what is it that drives you? As we've learned about your journey. You're only partway through, and certainly you have a lot of irons and a lot of fires, and you'll be crafting a lot of metal work with all those irons. So, what is it that pushes you and inspires you to inspire others?
Yeah, I just feel like there is a void there. There is a void, and the void is creating serious issues to a lot of people, and those people, I think, will go through life, and who knows how long it's going to take them to come to certain realization. And my goal is not to change the world, but my goal is to provide sort of some of my viewpoints and experiences, and bring them to bear, so that people can look at them and start questioning. And it's more of a constructivistic approach, so to speak, where I'm bringing all these things in, and you definitely don't have to agree with all of those things, and you definitely don't have to agree in the way I necessarily view things. But but did you start looking internally on account of hearing what it is that I had to say? And so for me, it's all about having the conversations, and it's about having honest conversations, because we're throwing a lot of distractions and things, and disco balls or whatever, but like, we're not having the tough conversations. So before we worry about having a wellness initiative that brings outside sources to do regular training that costs money, and you start going down this thing, how about, what are we doing in the patrol room? Let's start here. What are we doing in the
Hmm.
patrol room? Okay, I've seen A, B, C, and D here. All those things are contributing to affecting the wellness of others and yours, right? And so let's fix that. And then let's move this up now to another level here. And what can we own here? And what can we fix here? And how can we be a part of the solution as opposed to a part of the problem? I think there's a lot of people that look at policing like, somehow it's always going to be this, and it's always going to be that, and for me, I look back at my career, and I had an absolutely incredible career. Incredible. And I've had people say to me before, well, us in the organization. And I mean, what do you mean us? It's people of visible minority, just the way I was. And I'm like, no, actually I don't, because it's never interfered with my career,
Hmm.
ever. And I'm not suggesting it's not happening. I'm not suggesting there isn't racism, and I'm not suggesting there isn't things. But I was never a victim. Even if I was to be victimized by someone, I was not a victim,
Mm.
in my actions and in
Right.
my attitude. And so for me, it was like, whatever, man, water under the bridge, let's go. What's next? And I think a lot of people are investing a lot of their own emotions in the context of the application of the stuff that they do on the daily, in the context of policing. So emotions are good. Acknowledge them and move on.
Mm.
Like, if you're
Yeah.
if they're the angular stone of how you react to life, like, I got some news for you. You're always going to be in the black or the white. There's very little room for gray when you're reacting to every emotion that goes through you.
Yeah. And I love that for so many reasons. I think it's a good way to kind of, summarize a lot of the things we're talking about, because in the things that you share in your lessons and the concepts, I hear a lot of stoicism. I hear a lot of approaching things with a practical nature. Hey, emotions aren't bad. They are they are there. Acknowledge them. Sometimes they can be useful, and other times they can slow you down, right? And a lot of your conversations about bandwidth. That's something that I think about all the time, right? Because everything takes energy. We have limited time, we have limited energy, we have limited resource. So let's reflect on that and let's use it very, very wisely, and not waste it, and not burden ourselves with the petty inconveniences and negativity that plagues our world and our communities. So, I appreciate all that, and I think that all those notions, everything that you've shared with us in this session, uh, are very much in the vein of how do you stay progressing forward, how do you stay challenging yourself and uplifting others, and just really making like you said, you're being constructive and you're being positive, and keep going from there.
Yeah. No, absolutely, man. And it sounds like you're on the exact same mission. So we're I'm very fortunate, truly grateful to have examples like yourself, Sean and Chance, just to name a few. um, and I do think it's funny that he also brought up disco ball on his on his interview too, so there's definitely some connections there. Seb, yeah, I really want to thank you so much for your time sharing with me and the audience. Where can folks find you? And of course, the information in your bio will be in the show notes as well. amazing. Yeah, my personal Instagram is probably the best way to find me, and that's good and bad news for everybody around me. But it is one way to get a hold of me. Now, professionally speaking, my business account is www.ravenstrategic with a K.com, and that's my business for any business inquiries, and it goes straight to my email, and I will be dealing with this then. But if you prefer to reach me on Instagram, I'm sure you'll link the account, is
Hmm.
my Slav CCMDR, and that is it. Aside from that, if there's any further linking up needed, I can provide phone numbers and do all this good stuff, but I certainly will stay away from the air with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Where's the IG handle come from?
It's actually, so my nickname on the team was Cobra Commander, and it's my initials, Seb
Mm.
Lavoie, so SLAV, and then Cobra Commander. So it was just an amalgamation of reality and fiction.
I love that. That's what a perfect way to end. Thank you again, man. And we'll be talking soon, I'm sure.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, brother. Have interest outside of the field of policing, and you're capable of conversing on other topics